The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices screaming in the dead of night. Snow swirled in thick, blinding sheets, turning the forest into an endless void of white. Every breath burned in his chest, every step felt heavier, slower. His legs ached, his fingers numb inside soaked gloves. Miles away from civilization, lost in the brutal heart of a blizzard, Daniel knew he was running out of time. Then he saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the storm, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the snow. Relief surged through him, momentarily dulling the ache in his frozen leg. He stumbled toward it, half walking, half crawling, his boots sinking into the deep snow. When he reached the front porch, he didn't bother knocking. His shaking hands fumbled with the latch, pushing the door open. Warmth greeted him immediately, a sharp contrast to the brutal cold outside. The fire was already burning in the stone fireplace. He hesitated. The air smelled of charred wood, but there was no sound, no signs of movement. He stepped inside, slowly, his breath unsteady. The room was modest, wooden furniture, a thick rug covering the floor, a single lantern casting flickering shadows along the walls. A table sat in the corner, a half-drunk mug of something resting on top. The steam still curled from it, twisting into the dim air. Someone had been here recently. "Hello?" His voice barely carried, swallowed by the crackling fire. No response. He waited, listening. The cabin felt still, unnaturally so, as if holding its breath. Outside, the storm raged, sealing him inside. There was no choice. He would stay until morning. He removed his wet jacket, hanging it over the back of a chair. His body trembled violently from the cold, the warmth of the fire making the pain in his fingers sharper, more unbearable. He sat on the rug, stretching his hands toward the flames. The flickering light cast shifting shapes along the walls, shadows that moved strangely, almost deliberately. He shook the thought away. Exhaustion was setting in, his mind slipping into a hazy state. His eyes flicked toward the ceiling. A wooden door, slightly ajar, led to what he assumed was the attic. A draft moved through it, barely perceptible, rustling the loose pages of an open journal on the table. He reached for it, fingers stiff, flipping through the fragile, yellowed pages. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "If you find this, I am sorry. Do not open the attic door, no matter what you hear. It knows when you're alone." A sharp thud from above sent ice through his veins. He froze, every nerve in his body on. It wasn't the wind, it was something deliberate. Another thud, closer to the edge of the attic door. He slowly set the journal down, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His eyes locked onto the ceiling, silent. The storm outside shrieked against the walls, making them tremble, but inside, everything had gone completely still. His heart pounded. He counted the seconds, waiting. Then came the whisper, software muffled, coming from above. A low creak followed, as if something was shifting just beyond the door. He clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay put. The journal's words repeated in his mind. "Do not open the attic door." The whispering continued, growing clearer. It was saying his name. His breath hitched. He hadn't told anyone he was here. The lantern flickered violently, casting the room into sporadic darkness. He forced himself to look away from the ceiling, gripping the edges of the chair. The storm outside seemed to grow angrier, rattling the windows, shaking the walls. Another whisper, this time closer. A loud crash exploded above him. The attic door slammed shut. His body reacted before his mind caught up. He lunged for the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly as he backed away from the center of the room. His pulse thundered in his ears. The air had changed. It was heavier. Wrong. A slow, deliberate knock echoed from above. 1, 2, 3, then silence. The storm roared outside, suffocating all other sound. But he could feel it. Something was still there, watching, waiting. The fire sputtered as if struggling against an unseen force. His fingers tightened around the poker, the iron cold against his skin. He wasn't going to sleep, not tonight. The hours dragged. He remained near the fire, refusing to look at the attic. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the wind outside made his nerves fray further. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken him, because when he opened his eyes again, the fire had dimmed to weak embers. The first light of dawn barely touched the windows. Something was wrong. He turned his head, stiff from tension. The attic door was open again. A single wet footprint led down from the stairs. It was not his own. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind screaming for him to move, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The air smelled damp, rotten. He could feel something behind him, close, too close, a whisper, so near it felt like breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have stayed." Pain shot through his chest, ice cold and paralyzed. He staggered, hands clawing at his shirt, at the skin beneath, feeling something move under it, something that shouldn't be there. The fire in the hearth died completely, and the cabin door slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but white beyond. The road was a frozen ribbon stretching endlessly into the night, its edges swallowed by thick drifts of snow. The blizzard had worsened in the last hour, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Ice clung to the windshield, forcing Mark to crank the defroster to full blast. His fingers gripped the wheel tighter as the wind howled around his truck, shaking it violently. He should have stopped at the last gas station, should have waited out the storm, but he had a delivery to make and a deadline to meet. Now, he was regretting that decision. The highway was deserted. No other cars, no lights, just the endless swirl of white engulfing the world beyond his headlights. The monotony of the drive, the rhythmic thumping of the wipers, the soft hum of the heater, it was almost hypnotic. He blinked hard, trying to stay focused. That was when he saw her. A lone figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible through the haze of snow. A woman wrapped in a long, dark coat, her hood pulled up over her face. She wasn't waving for help, wasn't moving, just standing there, rigid and unmoving, as if she had been waiting for him. Mark's stomach tightened. He knew the dangers of stopping for strangers, especially this far out in the middle of nowhere. But something about her gave him pause. Maybe it was the way she stood, not shivering, not even shifting her weight, completely still, like a statue in the storm. As he drove past her, his headlights briefly illuminated her face. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. She was staring directly at him. Her face was pale, lips slightly parted, but her eyes were wide, black voids, endless and empty. Mark's foot slammed on the gas instinctively, his heart hammering in his chest. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning against the icy road, before finally gaining traction. His hands trembled on the wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Just exhaustion playing tricks on you. Then the radio crackled. Static burst through the speakers, followed by a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was the storm outside, but the longer he listened, the clearer it became. "Don't stop." Mark's breath hitched. The voice was soft, female, but distorted, as if spoken through layers of interference. The static grew louder, a harsh screech that made his teeth clench. He reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. "Don't stop." Then, just as suddenly as it started, the radio cut to silence. Mark exhaled, his pulse still pounding. Just interference, just the storm. He told himself that over and over. Then he checked his rearview mirror. The woman was standing in the middle of the road. Mark's breath left him in a shuddering gasp. There was no way. He had been driving for miles. She couldn't have. The truck swerved. The tires hit a patch of black ice, and suddenly the world spun. The headlights swept across the snowy darkness as the vehicle skidded sideways, tires shrieking against the frozen road. His hands wrestled the wheel, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The truck slammed into a snowbank, the impact jolting him forward against his seatbelt. His head snapped back against the headrest. For a few moments, everything was still. Then, the soft crunch of snow. Footsteps. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving toward him. He turned his head and his blood turned to ice. The woman was standing at his window. She was impossibly close, her face inches from the glass. Snowflakes clung to her skin, but she didn't seem affected by the cold. Her lips curled into a small, almost pitying smile. Then, she raised her hand and knocked. 3 slow, measured taps. Mark was frozen in place, his fingers gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, she whispered his name. A scream clawed at his throat, but no sound escaped. His vision blurred with panic, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. Mark gasped, his body jolting forward as if waking from a nightmare. The road was empty again, only the wind and snow swirling in the headlights. His heart slammed against his ribs, sweat dripping down his back, despite the freezing air. He fumbled with the gear shift, his hands trembling violently as he forced the truck into reverse, yanking the wheel, desperate to get back onto the road. The engine groaned, tires spinning in the deep snow before finally catching. He didn't look back. He drove through the storm, white-knuckled, forcing himself not to glance at the mirrors, not to listen for any more whispers. But the fear never left. Even long after the storm had passed, long after he reached the safety of a well-lit gas station, he still felt it. The sense that someone was watching, that somewhere, just beyond the reach of the headlights, she was still standing, still waiting for him to stop. The town of Hollow Pines had always been known for its brutal winters. Snowstorms would roll in without warning, burying streets, swallowing houses, turning the world into an endless white void. Jacob had lived there all his life. knew the dangers, knew the stories, but he never believed them until the night he saw the thing in the snow. It started with a simple mistake. His car had broken down miles from him, the engine dying with a choking sputter as he drove through the back road. The storm had already begun, thick snowflakes hammering the windshield. The wind screamed, rattling the car as if trying to tear it apart. He cursed under his breath, pulling out his phone. No signal. There was no choice. He would have to walk. The road stretched ahead, barely visible under the growing drifts. He pulled his coat tighter around him, burying his gloved hands deep into his pockets. The cold bit at his exposed skin, sharp as needles. The town wasn't far. If he kept moving, he would be fine. Then he saw them. The footprints, they stretched across the snow-covered road, leading from the woods. Deep, distinct, but there was something wrong about them. They weren't human. The prints were elongated, too narrow, too sharp. The stride was too long, as if whatever made them had impossibly long limbs. Worse, they weren't sinking into the snow, as if the thing that left them was barely touching the ground. Jacob's breath hitched, fogging the air. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then he heard it, a low whisper carried on the wind, curling around him like a breath against the back of his neck. His blood ran cold. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness. Snow swirled in thick waves, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. His heartbeat thundered. He was alone, wasn't he? The whisper came again, closer. The footprints in the snow had moved. His stomach twisted violently. He had just looked at them. They hadn't been there before. They were leading toward him now. Something was watching him. Jacob spun on his heel, running. The wind howled, the snow burned his face, but he didn't stop. The road was barely visible, his boots sinking into the thick drifts, but he pushed forward, breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, the footsteps behind him, soft, barely audible beneath the wind. But they were there, and they were too fast. He didn't dare look. He couldn't. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep moving, to get away. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps kept pace. Then, just ahead, a light, a house, a small, lonely cabin standing at the edge of the road. A weak glow flickered from the window, barely visible through the storm. Jacob lunged forward, nearly slipping as he reached the porch. His frozen fingers fumbled at the doorknob. It turned, unlocked. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut behind him. Silence. His breath came in ragged gasps. The house was empty. The air smelled of old wood and dust. A fireplace stood at the far end of the room, unlit. A pile of logs stacked beside it. The furniture was simple. Worn chairs, a table, a faded rug. No sign of anyone living here. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Jacob exhaled shakily, pressing his forehead against the door. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the storm was making him see things, making him hear. Knock, knock, knock. His entire body froze. The sound came from the door, slow, deliberate, not the wind. Jacob's breath hitched. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to turn around, his back pressing against the cold wood. The house suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Then, a whisper from inside the room. His heart stopped. The sound hadn't come from outside. It was here, inside, with him. A slow creak echoed from the shadows near the fireplace. A figure moved, stepping forward, emerging from the darkness. Jacob's stomach twisted, his knees nearly buckled. It was him. The figure standing in the dim light was identical to him. Same face, same eyes, same clothes dusted with fresh snow. But its head was tilted slightly, its mouth stretched into something that was almost a grin. Too wide, too wrong. It lifted a single, frost-bitten finger to its lips. Shh. Jacob didn't scream, because suddenly he couldn't move, couldn't blink. His body felt wrong, heavy, frozen. His own reflection in the window didn't move. And then, as if waking from a dream, he realized he was the one standing in the dark, watching, waiting. The storm had come in fast, swallowing the landscape in a thick, blinding white. The world outside was a frozen void, endless and silent, except for the howling wind that rattled the old cabin's windows. Ethan tightened his coat around him, exhaling a shuddering breath as he peered outside. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from town. He had rented it for the weekend, hoping for a peaceful retreat, a break from the stress of city life. Instead, he was trapped. The snow had piled up past the windows, and the power had flickered out an hour ago, leaving only the dim glow of the fireplace to hold back the darkness. Ethan checked his phone. No signal. He sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He had enough firewood to last the night, maybe 2 if he was careful. It would have to do. Then, somewhere in the storm, a knock. His breath hitched. He turned toward the door, heart pounding. Maybe it was the wind, a branch hitting the wood. But then it came again. Knock, knock, slow, deliberate. Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen any other cabins on the way up here. No roads leading to neighboring houses, He was completely alone, or at least he was supposed to be. A third knock, louder. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. Hello? His voice sounded thin in the heavy silence. No answer. Just the wind outside, the distant creak of tree branches straining against the storm. He hesitated before unlocking the door, pulling it open just an inch. The cold rushed in, biting at his skin. Snow swirled violently, but there was no one there. No footprints, just the endless white. His gut churned. He had heard it. There was no mistaking it. Someone, something, had knocked. He shut the door, locking it this time. His pulse thundered in his ears as he backed away. It's just the wind, just your imagination. Then, from the window across the room, movement. A shadow flickered past the glass. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to turn off the lantern, to plunge the room into darkness, so whatever was outside couldn't see in. But his body refused to move. Instead, he forced himself forward, step by step, until he reached the window. Snow streaked the glass, distorting his view, but there was something standing just beyond the tree line. A figure, tall, thin, motionless, almost human, but too still. Ethan's chest tightened. He squinted against the snow, trying to make out its features. It was wearing something dark, tattered. A coat? Or was that its skin? Then, as if sensing his stare, the figure tilted its head. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his throat. No, that was impossible. He yanked the curtain shut, backing away from the window. His breaths came in sharp gasps. A sudden thought gripped him. The door. He turned toward it, just as the handle twisted. Ethan lunged forward, pressing all his weight against the wood as something pushed from the other side. His fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting it, securing it just as the door shook violently. The entire cabin seemed to groan under the force of whatever was outside. The knocking returned harder this time. Bang! 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 Then, silence. Ethan didn't move. He hardly breathed. His body remained rigid against the door. Minutes passed, stretching into eternity. Then, from behind him, a whisper. Let me. His stomach twisted violently. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, right behind him. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The fireplace cast long shadows against the wooden walls. The room was empty, but the whisper came again. Closer. Let me. Ethan's hands trembled. His legs felt locked in place, refusing to run, to do anything but stand frozen in terror. Then, the lights flickered, just for a second. But in that moment of darkness, he saw it. The figure. Inside the room with him, standing in the corner. Its body impossibly still, had tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, it smiled. Ethan didn't remember screaming. He didn't remember falling. But suddenly, the floor was cold against his back, and the world was the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him. That grin, wide, endless, hungry. Then, nothing. The next morning, the storm had passed. The cabin door was wide open. Snow had blown inside, covering the wooden floor in a thick, frozen layer. The fireplace had gone out, and Ethan was gone. No footprints led away from the cabin, just an open door, and a whisper lingering in the empty room. Let me in. The wind screamed through the dense pines, carrying with it a heavy snowfall that blanketed the narrow, winding road. Mason gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. His tires crunched over the fresh snow as he followed the dim glow of his headlight. He shouldn't have been out here this. The plan was to get back to his apartment before the worst of the storm hit, but he had lost track of time at his friend's cabin. Now, the road was barely visible and his GPS had cut out miles ago. He had been driving blind, hoping to see a familiar landmark, anything that told him he was headed in the right direction. Then, a figure in the road. Mason's heart lurched as he slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires slipping on the ice before jerking to a stop. The headlights illuminated someone standing in the middle of the road. A woman. She was barefoot. Mason's pulse pounded in his ears. The woman's hair hung in tangled, frozen strands over her shoulders. She was wearing only a thin, tattered nightgown, the fabric clinging to her pale, emaciated frame. Her skin was wrong, blue-tinted, lips cracked, eyes hollow, and yet she was smiling. Mason swallowed hard. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. She's in trouble. She needs help. But something deep in his gut told him not to open the door. Instead, he reached for his phone. No signal. The woman took a step forward. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Her movements were unnatural, gliding rather than walking, her feet never quite sinking into the snow. The wind howled around them, but her hair didn't move. Then she tilted her head, her smile stretching too wide. Mason's body locked in place. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to drive, to get away from this thing standing in the road. Then she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. It's so cold. Mason's fingers gripped the gear shift, but before he could react, the back door unlocked. A wave of terror crashed through him. The soft click echoed through the car, louder than the storm. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Something was in the back seat. A breath, not his own, fogged the rearview mirror. Mason slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching traction, and the car lurched forward. He didn't look back, not even when he heard the laughter, high-pitched, hollow, coming from both outside and inside the car. The road twisted ahead, barely visible through the snow, but Mason didn't slow down. His only thought was to get away, as far and as fast as possible. Then, the woman was in front of him. Mason's stomach plummeted. It was impossible. He had just left her behind. But there she was, standing in the middle of the road, arms outstretched, that awful smile still carved into her frozen face. He had no time to stop. Mason clenched his teeth and braced for impact. But when the car hit her, there was nothing. No thud, no resistance. She simply vanished. The car swerved violently, skidding off the road, crashing through the thick snowbanks. Mason barely registered the impact before everything went black. When he came to, the car was still. The engine was dead. His head throbbed and a thin trail of blood ran down his temple. The storm had quieted. His breath hitched as he reached for his phone. Still no signal. Then a whisper. Software. Close. It's so cold. Mason's stomach twisted. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The whisper hadn't come from outside. It had come from the passengers. With a shaking hand, he turned his head. She was sitting beside him. The woman. Her frozen blue lips inches from his ear. Her hollow eyes locked onto his. This time, she wasn't smiling. She was screaming. The storm had turned vicious, lashing against the old motel like an angry beast. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, barely visible through the thick sheets of snow. Logan tightened his jacket around him as he stepped inside the small, dimly lit lobby. The place reeked of stale air and something else, something off. The front desk was empty. A tarnished bell sat on the counter, and Logan hesitated before pressing it. The sound rang through the room, unnervingly loud against the storm's muffled howls. A moment later, an old man shuffled out from the back office. His face was weathered, his eyes dull. He didn't smile. "Need a room?" the man asked, his voice rough. Logan nodded. "Yeah, just for the night." The man slid a key across the counter. "Room 6. Storm's bad," the old man muttered. "Don't leave your room after midnight." Logan frowned. "Why?" The man's stare was vacant. He didn't answer. The room was as depressing as Logan had expected. Faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, a stained carpet, a small TV with static playing faintly on the screen. The bed sagged when he sat on it, springs groaning under his weight. He checked his phone. No signal. Sighing, he lay back and closed his eyes, the howling wind outside lulling him into uneasy sleep. He woke up to a sound, scraping. His heart pounded as he sat up. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the motel's flickering neon light outside. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape against the door. Logan held his breath. Was someone outside? Then came the knock. Software measured. Too slow to be normal. A chill crawled up his spine. He glanced at the clock. 12:03 a.m. Don't leave your room after midnight. He crept toward the door, pressing his eye against the peephole. His stomach turned to ice. There was a man standing there, or at least it looked like a man. His face was pale, too pale, like stretched wax. His lips were thin, curled into a frozen grin, and his eyes, they were wide, unblinking, staring directly at the peephole. Logan staggered back. His pulse roared in his ears. Then, the man on the other side laughed. Low, guttural, wrong. The doorknob twisted. Logan lunged for the deadbolt, heart hammering against his ribs. The knob rattled violently, harder this. Then, silence. He stood there, frozen, ears straining against the quiet. Then, from inside the room, a whisper. "Let me in." Logan spun around. His breath came in short gasps. The room was empty, but something felt different. The air was colder. The shadows seemed deeper. He backed up slowly, his body shaking. Then, in the reflection of the old TV screen, a shape behind him. He didn't turn. He couldn't. The whisper came again, this time right beside his ear. "You already did!" The lights flickered, and then everything went black. By morning, room 6 was empty. The bed was untouched. The door was locked from the inside. Logan was never seen again. The old man at the front desk didn't seem surprised. He simply took the room key back, placed it on the rack, and waited for the next traveler to check in. The snowstorm had swallowed the road, turning everything into a swirling white void. Ethan squinted through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel tight. His GPS had given up miles ago, and the last road sign he passed was buried under a thick layer of ice. He didn't even know if he was still heading in the right direction. He was alone in the middle of nowhere, and then, through the blizzard, he saw the house. A large, two-story cabin sat at the edge of the forest, its dark windows standing out against the snow. A single porch light flickered dimly, as if struggling against the storm. Ethan exhaled in relief. Shelter. Pulling into the driveway, he cut the engine and stepped out into the freezing night. The cold bit into his skin instantly, and he hurried up the steps. The wood creaked under his boots. There was no doorbell. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The wind howled around him, the cold sinking into his bones. If no one was home, he had no choice but to keep driving. But then, the door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway. She was pale, her long black hair hanging in tangled strands over her shoulders. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, something that looked out of place for a house like this. She didn't say anything. Hi, Ethan stammered, shifting uncomfortably. I'm sorry to bother you, but my car can't make it through the storm. Is it okay if I stay here for a while? Just until it dies down? The woman tilted her head slightly. Then, without a word, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Something about her unsettled him, but the freezing wind pushed him forward. He stepped inside. The house was old. The wooden floor groaned under his weight, and the air inside was stale, carrying a faint, musty scent. The furniture was antique, covered in dust. The fireplace was lit, but the heat barely reached him. Thank you, Ethan said, turning to face the woman. She was already walking away, disappearing down a dark hallway. He hesitated. Do you live here alone? She didn't respond. A deep sense of wrongness settled in his stomach, but he shook it off. It's just an old house. He moved closer to the fire, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Then he heard the whispering, software faint, coming from somewhere upstairs. Ethan froze. His skin prickled. It wasn't the woman's voice. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, whispering too fast for him to understand. He swallowed hard. Maybe there were other people living here. Maybe they just hadn't come out yet. And then, a loud creak. Ethan turned his head sharply toward the staircase. A figure was standing at the top. It was a child. A boy. Maybe 10 years old. He wore old-fashioned pajamas, his small hands gripping the wooden railing. But what made Ethan's stomach churn was his face. The boy's eyes were completely black. The whispers grew louder. The boy raised one hand, slowly, shakily, and pointed at Ethan. The whispering stopped, and then the lights went out. Ethan's breath hitched. He spun around, heart slamming against his ribs. The fire had died instantly, plunging the house into freezing darkness. Footsteps, software bare feet padding toward him. He backed up until his spine pressed against the cold wall. His fingers fumbled for his phone, but when he turned it on, the screen showed a reflection of the room behind him. And in that reflection, the woman was standing right behind him. Her mouth was wide open as if screaming, but no sound came. Ethan didn't have time to react. The last thing he felt was ice-cold hands wrapping around his throat. By morning, the house was empty again. The storm had passed. Ethan's car was still parked in the driveway, covered in snow. And inside the house, in the dust-covered living room, a new portrait had appeared on the wall. A painting of a man, his eyes wide with terror. The blizzard had come out of nowhere. One moment, Riley was driving down the winding mountain road, and the next, the world had turned into a white, swirling nightmare. His headlights barely cut through the thick snow, and the road beneath his tires was nearly invisible. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He had to find shelter. Then, through the storm, he saw it. A gas station. A single, flickering light above the station's roof cast a dim glow onto the snow-covered ground. The building was old, the windows coated in grime, the sign barely legible beneath years of neglect. But it was the only thing out here. Riley pulled in, the crunch of tires on snow the only sound besides the wind. He cut the engine and stepped out, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. The air was bitterly cold, and the moment he shut his car door, the wind stole the warmth from his skin. The gas station looked abandoned. No cars, no fresh footprints, just an open door, swinging slightly in the wind. Riley hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay in his car, but his gas tank was nearly empty, and he had no idea how far the next town was. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The interior was wrong. The shelves were stocked with old, dust-covered products, faded chip bags, rusted cans, candy bars and wrappers that hadn't been sold in decades. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. And then there was the smell, a sharp, metallic scent, like rust and something rotting. "Hello?" Riley called, his voice echoing slightly. No response. He took another step inside, his boots scuffing against the grimy tile floor. The coolers hummed, but the glass was fogged over, as if something warm had been inside them moments before. Then, the door slammed shut behind him. Riley spun around, his heart hammering. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but the door wouldn't budge. And then, from behind the counter, he heard it, a faint, wet sound. Drip, drip, drip. His breath hitched. Slowly, he stepped closer, peering over the counter. The cash register was covered in dust. The surface was cracked and peeling. But what made his stomach turn was the puddle of dark, congealed blood seeping from behind it. Then, footsteps, not from behind the counter, from the back room. A shuffling, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Riley took a step back, his pulse roaring in his ears. He hadn't seen anyone when he entered. There was no one here, but something was coming. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he saw it. A hand, long, bony fingers gripping the doorframe. Too long, too thin, and then the fingers moved, gripping tighter, pulling something forward. Riley's body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like concrete. The door creaked open wider, and then a face emerged, but it wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, black voids that reflected no light. Its mouth stretched far too wide, the skin around it cracked, as if it had been smiling for too long. And the worst part? It looked like it recognized. The thing tilted its head. Then it spoke, in his own voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Riley finally moved. He lunged for the door, yanking at the handle with all his strength. The thing was behind him now. He could feel its breath, cold, reeking of something long dead. The lights flickered once, and everything went black. The storm cleared by morning. Riley's car sat untouched at the abandoned gas station. The station itself had been closed for 40 years, and in the dusty glass of the cooler, smeared with condensation, there was a single handprint, too long, too thin, and a faint, lingering whisper in the frozen air, "You shouldn't have come here." The snowstorm had swallowed the highway, leaving Aaron stranded in a silent, white abyss. His car's engine sputtered, the fuel gauge dipping dangerously close to empty. He had no choice but to pull over. The wind howled outside, rattling his windows, like unseen hands trying to claw their way in. He checked his phone. No signal. Then, in the distance, through the swirling snow, he saw it. A house. A massive Victorian-style mansion stood alone in the middle of the snow-covered fields. Its dark windows stared out like empty eyes, its front door slightly ajar. The entire scene felt wrong. But Aaron had no other option. Bracing against the wind, he trudged toward the house, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The temperature seeped into his bones, and by the time he reached the porch, his fingers were numb. He hesitated. The house loomed over him, too quiet, no footprints in the snow, no lights inside. Still, he knocked. No answer. The wind screamed behind him, and he stepped inside. The air inside was stale. The walls were lined with portraits, massive, old, and covered in dust. Each painting depicted a person, their faces stern and lifeless. A massive chandelier hung above, though its bulbs flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay alive. "Hello?" Aaron called. Silent. His footsteps echoed as he wandered deeper inside. The place felt abandoned, yet there was no dust on the furniture, no signs of decay. The air smelled like it had been sealed away from time. Then the whispering started, soft, faint, like voices trapped in the walls. Aaron turned sharply, his breath coming in short gasps. No one was there. He forced himself forward, his heartbeat pounding against his... Maybe there was a landline. Maybe someone actually lived here. Then, as he passed one of the paintings, he noticed something. The woman in the portrait was staring at him. His stomach twisted. He was sure she had been looking straight ahead before. He took a step closer. Her face was detailed, too detailed. The brushstrokes were so fine that it looked almost real. Then, as he stared, her mouth moved. "You shouldn't be here." Aaron stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The whispering grew louder. The other paintings, their eyes moved, their expressions shifting. Then, from upstairs, a creaking sound, slow, deliberate. Aaron turned his head toward the staircase. Shadows stretched unnaturally long against the walls as something moved. A figure, tall, wrong, standing at the top of the... It was a man, but his body was distorted, his limbs too thin, his neck too long. His face was wrong, stretched and smiling, lips cracked from being held in that expression for too long, and in his hand, a can. The wax dripped down his fingers, but he didn't flinch. Then, in a voice not his own, the man spoke. "The storm brought you to..." Aaron bolted. His feet pounded against the wooden floor as he sprinted for the front door. But when he reached it, it was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly. The walls morphed, twisting and shifting, the paintings warping into grotesque expressions. Behind him, the footsteps began. Slow at first, then faster. Aaron turned a corner and ran straight into a mirror. He recoiled, panic clawing at his throat. But then he realized something. His reflection wasn't moving. Aaron lifted a shaking hand. The mirror version of him stayed still, and then it smiled. Not a normal smile. A wide, unnatural grin stretching far too much, revealing rows of too sharp teeth. The reflection stepped forward. Aaron couldn't move. His own face stared back at him, except now it wasn't his. The whispering grew deafening. The walls shifted, breathing. The reflection pressed a hand against the glass and pushed through. Aaron let out a scream as cold, ghostly fingers wrapped around his throat. Then, darkness. By morning, the mansion stood silent. The storm had passed. The snow had settled. Aaron's car remained on the roadside, empty, the driver's seat door wide open. And inside the house, hanging among the others, was a new painting, a portrait of a man. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, and his eyes followed you wherever you went. The storm had chased Daniel for miles. Thick snow battered his windshield, the wipers barely able to keep up. The radio had long since given out, leaving only the eerie silence between gusts of howling wind. His hands were numb on the steering wheel, his breath fogging up the glass. Then, through the blizzard, he saw it, a motel. It stood alone on the roadside, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly in the storm. The building was old, the paint peeling, the windows dark, but it was shelter, and Daniel had no choice. He pulled into the empty parking lot, his tires crunching through the snow. No other cars, no footprints leading to the entrance. Still, he stepped out, hugging his coat tightly around him as he pushed through the frozen air and into the lobby. The interior was strangely warm, too warm. The heat pressed against his skin, suffocating compared to the freezing cold outside. The front desk was empty. A small bell sat on the counter. Dust settled in the crevices. Daniel hesitated, then rang it. Ding! The sound echoed too much in the quiet space. Then, footsteps. A figure emerged from the back room, moving slowly. The clerk was an old man, dressed in a faded brown uniform. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were too wide. His thin lips pulled into an unsettling smile as he placed an old-fashioned key on the counter. "No guests tonight," the clerk murmured. His voice was too smooth, too calm. "Room 204 is ready for you." Daniel hesitated. "I didn't even tell you I needed a room." The clerk's smile didn't falter. "We've been expecting you." A shiver crawled down Daniel's spine. He should have walked away right then, but the storm outside raged against the walls, and exhaustion weighed heavy in his bones. He took the key. The second floor was eerily silent. The hallway stretched out longer than it should have. The doors on either side too uniform, too perfect. The air smelled faintly of something old, rotting wood, stale air, something else he couldn't place. Room 204 stood at the very end. Daniel slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. Inside, the room was normal, almost. A bed, an old TV, a nightstand, a small bathroom to the side, but something felt off. The wallpaper peeled in odd places. The furniture looked too still, as if it had never been touched. And the mirror. It hung on the wall across from the bed. Too large, too old, its glass slightly warped. Daniel set down his bag, exhaling shakily. He was overthinking things. The storm was messing with his head. He peeled off his coat, sat on the bed, and stared at the mirror. Then, movement. His stomach lurched. His reflection blinked, but Daniel hadn't. He shot to his feet, his breath quickening. The reflection stood still, watching it. Then, it grinned. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He took a slow step back, but his reflection didn't. It tilted its head, as if studying. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The mirror rippled, like water. Daniel's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. That wasn't possible. He turned, reaching for the door, but it wouldn't open. Behind him, the whispering started. Soft, distant, growing closer. He turned back to the mirror and saw himself standing on the other side. Not his reflection. Him. The other Daniel smiled wider, placing both hands against the glass. Then, it stepped forward. The glass bent and stretched, like liquid parting around a body. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath coming in gasps. His doppelganger was coming through. Its fingers curled, skin too pale, too waxy, and its eyes were wrong. Empty, hollow, black. "No!" Daniel choked out, reaching for anything, any way out. But his twin was faster. It lunged forward, grabbing Daniel by the throat. Cold, so impossibly cold. Daniel's vision blurred. The room tilted. The last thing he saw, his own body, dragged into the mirror. Morning came. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. The motel stood silent, and in room 204, Daniel sat on the bed. A slow, creeping smile stretched across his lips, and in the mirror, the real Daniel pounded against the glass. His screams never left the surface.